The Mystery of Ms. Anthony. The story begins with a peculiar conversation between two unlikely friends. Captain Hawk, a seasoned sea captain who believed in leaving mysteries untouched, and Inspector Evans, a retired but ever-curious CID officer who thrived on uncovering secrets. "It's her! No doubt about it," exclaimed Evans, his eyes sparkling with the thrill of discovery. Captain Hawk sighed deeply, watching his friend with a mix of annoyance and amusement. Evans' excitement was almost infectious, but Hawken had spent a lifetime at sea, learning to avoid storms, whether on the ocean or in the lives of others. Evans leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Mrs. Anthony, that's who she is. The same woman, no mistake." Captain Hawk shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Maroyne, or Mrs. Anthony, as Evans now claimed, was his neighbor, an elegant, unassuming woman who had always kept to herself. But Evans' revelation unsettled him. "It's been years, Evans," Hawk said cautiously. "Why drag up the past now?" "Years and 3 months to be precise," Evans replied, his tone almost triumphant. "You must remember the case, a man named Anthony. Arsenic eater. It was all over the papers back then." Hawk nodded vaguely, recalling fragments of the scandal. "They acquitted her, didn't they?" Said he poisoned himself by accident. Evans smirked knowingly. "Acquitted, yes, but innocence? That's another matter entirely." The captain stiffened. "What are you implying?" Evans's grin faded, replaced by a sharp, calculating look. "I'm not implying anything, just pointing out facts. A jury gave her the benefit of the doubt. But doubt is what lingers, my friend." The air grew tense as Hawk tapped his pipe against the chair, his thoughts swirling. Evans, however, was not finished. "You saw Mr. Maroyne in his lab this evening, didn't you? Fiddling with chemical tests and laughing about arsenic. Do you think he knows about his wife's past?" Hawk's voice turned cold. "He won't hear it from me." "Of course not," Evans replied smoothly. "But what if her past isn't the only secret she's hiding?" The captain glared at his friend. "You're chasing shadows, Evans." "Am I?" The retired inspector leaned back, his tone both ominous and certain. "There's one thing I've learned about murderers. They're rarely content with just one crime." A suspicion renewed. "Once a murderer, always a murderer." Evans's words hung heavy in the air as Captain Hawk leaned back in his chair, puffing his pipe thoughtfully. "You know I'm not speaking legally," Evans continued, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm speaking of moral certainty. Once you have that, the evidence usually follows." Hawk raised an eyebrow. "And what if there's no past to look into? What if this is their first crime?" "Then the test might not yield a reaction," Evans admitted. "But suppose, just suppose, a murderer gets acquitted and starts life anew under another name. Will they, or won't they, repeat the crime?" "That's a horrible thought," Hawk muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "And frankly, I still say it's none of our business." Evans leaned closer, his expression darkening. "You've no reason to think Mrs. Maroyne is anything but a perfectly innocent woman." Hawk hesitated, but Evans wasn't done. "I told you we looked into her past and found nothing," he said, his tone sharp. "But that's not entirely true. There was an incident." Hawk frowned. "Incident?" "She had a stepfather," Evans began, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "When she was 18, she fancied a young man, but her stepfather opposed the match. One day, during a walk along a dangerous cliff, there was an accident. The stepfather went too close to the edge, it gave way, and he fell to his death." "You don't think it was an accident?" Hawk asked, his voice barely audible. Evans shrugged, but his eyes gleamed with unspoken suspicion. "Anthony's overdose of arsenic was an accident, too, or so they said. But there was another man back then, a lover. He disappeared after the trial, left, just like that. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Hawk exhaled sharply. "It's been 9 years, Evans. Why should there be another accident now?" "I didn't say now," Evans replied, his tone ominous. "I said someday, if the motive arises." Hawk shook his head. "And how do you plan to guard against something that hasn't even happened?" Evans didn't answer immediately, but his jaw tightened. "We'll see," he muttered, standing abruptly. A fortune-teller's ominous warning. That afternoon, Evans attended the village fair. He wandered aimlessly, buying stamps, shying at coconuts, and even indulging in a penny dip, all while his mind churned over the chilling parallels. Eventually, his steps led him to a small, dimly lit tent where a crystal gazer sat shrouded in mystery. Zara, the fortune-teller, beckoned him forward with a knowing smile. "Cross my palm with silver," she intoned, her voice dripping with theatricality. Amused but curious, Evans handed over a coin. Zara gazed into the crystal ball, her expression growing grave. You will soon face a matter of life or death, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. A decision you must make. Be very careful. A single mistake, no matter how small, will lead to a death. Evans froze, the words striking a nerve. A death? He asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping over him. Zara nodded solemnly. Yes, a life hangs in the balance. If you falter, the consequences will be dire. Evans stood abruptly, tossing her another coin. Thanks for the warning, he said lightly, though his jaw was set in determination. As he stepped out into the sunlight, her words echoed in his mind. A life hangs in the balance. Across the field, he spotted Captain Hawk talking to a woman. She turned, and Evans's breath caught. Mrs. Maroyne, her serene face and graceful demeanor betrayed no hint of darkness, yet Evans' instincts screamed otherwise. With deliberate intent, he intercepted her path. Mrs. Maroyne, he said smoothly, tipping his hat. She smiled at him warmly, her voice low and pleasant. Inspector Evans, how lovely to see you here. Evans forced a smile, but inside, his mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, and time was running out. Smile, he said, his voice smooth, almost casual. I thought it was you, Mrs. Anthony. He paused for a fraction of a second, then corrected himself. I mean, Mrs. Meriden. He said it with such a glib ease that it was clear the slip had been deliberate, a subtle test, perhaps. He watched her closely, without seeming to do so, his eyes narrowing as he saw her reaction. Her eyes widened for just a moment, and he could hear the quick intake of breath, like a sharp, startled gasp. But, to his surprise, her eyes didn't waver. They remained steady, unblinking, almost too composed, as if she had expected him to say it all along. She gazed at him, her expression proud, measured, as if daring him to analyze her every move. I was looking for my husband, she said quietly, her voice betraying no hint of anxiety. Have you seen him anywhere about? He hesitated before replying. He was over in that direction when I last saw him. Without another word, they moved side by side toward the indicated direction, their footsteps soft on the cobbled path. The inspector felt something stir inside him. Admiration. What a woman, he thought. What a remarkable blend of self-command and poise. He couldn't help but marvel at her ability to mask her thoughts so effortlessly. Yet, a nagging feeling of unease gnawed at him. She was not to be underestimated. There was something about her that felt dangerous. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but instinct told him to tread carefully. Despite his initial success in subtly revealing his recognition of her, a move that he hoped would keep her on guard, something still didn't sit right. She would be cautious now, no doubt. But was that enough? They continued their walk in silence until they found the little man, Professor Meriden, absently inspecting a china doll that had fallen to his share in the penny dip. His wife smiled gently at him, suggesting they go home. He agreed eagerly, almost too eagerly, and they continued toward the cottage. Mrs. Meriden turned to the inspector with a faint yet purposeful smile. Won't you come back with us? Have a quiet cup of tea? There was a slight challenge in her tone, something that lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniably present. The inspector caught it. Mr. Evans, she added, a slight lilt of intrigue in her voice, I'm sure you'd enjoy it. Thank you, Mrs. Meriden, the inspector replied, his voice warm but edged with curiosity. I should like that very much. They walked in harmony, conversing lightly about trivial things, the sun shining, a gentle breeze whispering through the trees. Everything around them was serene, peaceful, even ordinary, but the inspector couldn't shake the growing tension in the pit of his stomach. They arrived at the charming cottage, a place that seemed almost too perfect, too neat, too tidy, as if every detail had been carefully curated. Mrs. Meriden excused herself to remove her hat and returned to prepare tea. She moved gracefully, her every action deliberate, and it was in this moment that Evans realized something. A slight shift, a subtle tell, this was no ordinary tea. She reappeared shortly, carrying a silver lamp from a shelf near the fireplace. With practiced hands, she set 3 small bowls on the table. We have some very special Chinese tea, she explained, her voice smooth, carrying an air of quiet sophistication. We always drink it in the traditional Chinese manner, out of bowls, not cups. She paused, inspecting one of the bowls, then swapped it with another, her brow furrowing slightly. George, she said, with a touch of annoyance, it's too bad of you. You've been using these bowls again. Professor Meriden looked up, an apologetic expression on his face. I'm sorry, dear. They're just the right size, and the ones I ordered haven't come yet. Mrs. Meriden gave a half laugh, but there was a biting edge to it. One of these days, you'll poison us all, George. Mary finds them in the laboratory and brings them back here, but she never troubles to wash them out properly, unless something unusual is left inside. Why, you were using one of them for potassium cyanide just the other day. The professor looked momentarily irritated. Mary's no business removing things from the lab. She's not to touch anything there. But Mrs. Meriden remained calm, almost soothing. Be reasonable, dear. We often leave our teacups there after tea. How is she to know? As the professor retreated to his laboratory, murmuring something to himself, Mrs. Meriden poured boiling water over the tea leaves, the steam curling in the air. Evans watched closely, his mind turning over the scene before him. There was something deliberate in the way she moved, as if each action was calculated. He began to wonder, was this all part of her plan? Was she preparing her alibi, perhaps setting the stage for an accident, so that when the inevitable happened, she would be above suspicion? But then, as she placed the tea before him, his breath caught in his throat. It was in the way she looked at him, steadily, her eyes holding his, as if daring him to question her intentions. She placed one bowl before herself, another before him, and the third she set on a small table near the fire, where her husband usually sat. A strange smile played at the edges of her lips as she set the final bowl down, and in that moment, Evans felt a shiver run down his spine. It was the smile that gave it away. Without any delay or preparation, without hesitation, this could be it. This was the moment. Her boldness struck him like a blow. She was daring him to catch her, to prove it, to witness it. It was too soon, too obvious. He should have known it would be something like this. So cunning, so quick, so ruthlessly clever, he couldn't afford to be wrong. Standing suddenly, he took the bowl from in front of her and crossed to the small table where he swapped it with the one she had placed for her husband. Then he returned to her side, placing the other in front of her. "I want to see you drink this," he said, his voice low but steady. Her eyes locked onto his. She didn't flinch. Her gaze was unfathomable, her face an unreadable mask. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of a clock, the rustle of the fire. Then, with slow deliberation, she stretched her hand toward the bowl, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She raised it to her lips. Evans held his breath, but just before it touched her mouth, she paused. With a quick motion, she leaned forward and poured the contents into a pot near the fern. Her movements swift, sure, and calculated. She leaned back in her chair, a cold smile dancing across her lips. "You made a mistake, Mr. Evans," she said softly, her voice filled with mockery. "You thought I wanted to kill George. How stupid of you. How very stupid." For a moment, Evans just stared at her, his mind racing. What was she playing at? Why the theatrics? But then, in an instant, everything changed. His face contorted in agony as he collapsed, the tea, her tea, beginning its work. His body convulsed, his limbs stiffening. His skin turned purple as his breath quickened, and he fell, gasping, to the ground. Mrs. Meriden watched him die. Her gaze never wavered, her smile growing ever wider. She leaned forward, her voice gentle, almost tender. "Poor Mr. Evans, you were so close, yet so far. You thought you could outsmart me." She sat back, her smile now full and satisfied. The inspector had been the third man in her path, the one who might have disrupted her life, but now he was gone. She glanced over at her husband, still in the laboratory, unaware of the drama unfolding just a room away. "George," she called out softly, "do come here, darling. There's been the most dreadful accident. Poor Mr. Evans." Her voice held a note of feigned concern, but beneath it there was only triumph.